Los Angeles always had a way of amplifying emotions. The city's bright lights could make joy feel boundless, but they also cast shadows where doubt thrived. It was February 2023 when those shadows began creeping into my marriage. Lydia and I lived in a modern three-bedroom house in Brentwood, an affluent area tucked away from the bustling chaos of downtown LA. Our lives were comfortably predictable. I worked as a structural engineer for a top firm in Century City, while Lydia managed partnerships at a tech company headquartered in Santa Monica. For years, we had been the quintessential power couple: brunches in Malibu, charity galas in Beverly Hills, and vacations in Cabo San Lucas. But over the last few months, something had changed. It started subtly: missed kisses, her phone lighting up late at night with unexplained notifications. Lydia had become distant, her once warm demeanor replaced with a cool indifference. She'd brush off my attempts at intimacy, claiming she was too tired or stressed. "It's just work," she'd say, but her excuses felt hollow. Then came the wardrobe change. Suddenly, my wife, who usually favored casual elegance, brands like Taylor and Banana Republic, began dressing in haute couture. Gucci heels, a Saint Laurent blazer, a new Chanel bag that I certainly hadn't seen on our credit card statement. She even switched her perfume to Chanel Coco Mademoiselle, a scent that lingered in the air like a question I couldn't answer. One evening, while we were sitting in our minimalist living room, the dim light of a Ralph Lauren floor lamp casting a soft glow, Lydia casually mentioned her company's upcoming annual party. "It's at the Beverly Hills Hotel this year," she said, sipping her glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. I perked up. "That sounds nice. I'll clear my schedule and come with you." Her reaction was instant, a slight tensing of her shoulders, a flash of something in her eyes. "Oh, it's just for employees. You'd be bored to death. It's mostly small talk and shop talk." "Still," I pressed, "I'd like to meet your colleagues. It's been a while since we went out together." She set her glass down and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Alex, trust me, it's not worth your time. Besides, it's only a few hours." Her dismissal felt rehearsed, and my gut churned with unease. But I let it go, not wanting to seem paranoid. That night, as Lydia brushed her hair at the vanity in our bedroom, I caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked radiant, more vibrant than she had in months, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her glow wasn't for me. The evening of February 25th arrived, and Lydia was a vision as she stepped into her new Prada dress, an elegant black number that hugged her curves in ways I hadn't seen her flaunt in years. Her hair was styled in loose waves, and her makeup was flawless. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips barely grazing my skin, and said, "Don't wait up for me." As the door closed behind her, I sat in silence, staring at the glass of whiskey I'd poured. My mind raced. Something wasn't right, and I needed answers. That's when the idea hit me. I would crash the party. An hour later, I stood in front of the mirror, unrecognizable even to myself. A tailored Tom Ford suit, a crisp white shirt, and a bold black tie gave me the air of someone important. I slicked back my hair, adding a touch of pomade, and slipped on a pair of Persol sunglasses. Confidence surged as I hailed an Uber to the Beverly Hills Hotel. The hotel was a beacon of old Hollywood glamour, its pink facade glowing under the warm California night. A velvet rope marked the entrance to the grand ballroom, where the event was in full swing. I approached the burly bouncer with a smile. "Investor," I said smoothly, "here to check out the team." The bouncer barely looked at me before unclipping the rope. "Go right in." The ballroom was a dazzling spectacle. Crystal chandeliers, jazz music drifting through the air, and tables adorned with gold-accented centerpieces. I scanned the crowd, my heart pounding as I searched for Lydia. And then I saw her. She stood near the bar, laughing with a man I recognized from her work photos. He was young, probably late 20s, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were handsome. His tailored Armani suit and neatly styled hair screamed ambition. But what caught my attention was his hand, resting casually on her waist. I moved closer, my pulse racing, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out the jazz ensemble. I watched as they leaned into each other, their laughter too familiar, their body language far too intimate for colleagues. My stomach churned with a mix of rage and dread. Finally, I couldn't hold back. I strode over, my voice cutting through their private bubble. Lydia, mind introducing me to your friend? Lydia's expression froze for the briefest moment before she plastered on a smile I'd seen her use at networking events, smooth and practiced. Alex, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice light, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her surprise. Just thought I'd see what all the fuss was about, I replied, my tone sharp enough to slice through the pretense. And who's this? The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, but extended his hand. James Porter. I work with Lydia. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I locked eyes with him, the tension thick enough to draw glances from nearby partygoers. Is that why you've got your hand on my wife's waist, James? James stammered, his face flushing red, but Lydia was quicker on her feet. She placed a hand on my arm, as if to calm me. Oh, Alex, don't be ridiculous. James is gay. He's just a close friend. The word hung in the air like a bad punchline. My stomach churned with a mix of fury and disbelief. Is that so? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I turned to James. Are you gay, James? His eyes darted to Lydia, who gave him a subtle nod, her gaze pleading. Yes. Yes, I am, he said, his voice unconvincing. Really? I pressed, crossing my arms. Because nothing about the way you're touching my wife screams platonic. Lydia's laugh was forced, a brittle sound that made my skin crawl. Alex, stop it. You're embarrassing yourself. James, show him. Prove it. Before I could process her words, James stepped forward and leaned in, his lips brushing my cheek. The room seemed to go silent as my mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. The audacity, the humiliation. My fists clenched at my sides as James stepped back, looking anywhere but at me. There, Lydia said, her tone triumphant. Happy now? I stared at her, my jaw tight. She had played me, turned the tables so expertly that I felt like the fool in the room. My gaze flicked to James, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt, then back to Lydia. She had outmaneuvered me, but the fire inside me burned hotter than ever. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away, my chest tight with anger. The drive back to Brentwood was a blur. The lights of Los Angeles streaked past as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. By the time I stepped into the quiet of our home, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. I poured myself a glass of Jack Daniel's Single Barrel and sank into the leather armchair in our living room. How had it come to this? Lydia and I had built a life together. Years of love, trust, and shared dreams. Or so I thought. The memory of James's hand on her waist, her laughter, and that ridiculous kiss played on a loop in my mind. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was in her lies, her manipulation, and the worst part? She had made me doubt myself. As I sat there, nursing the whiskey, I realized something. This wasn't just about Lydia and James. It was about control, about reclaiming my dignity. I wasn't going to let her win. The next morning, Lydia walked into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. She wore a soft cashmere sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a loose bun, the picture of casual perfection. Morning, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. How'd you sleep? Fine, I replied curtly, not looking up from my phone. She hesitated, her gaze lingering on me. About last night? Save it. I cut her off, my tone ice cold. I'm not interested in whatever story you've cooked up. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, plastering on a smile. Alex, you're overreacting. James is just a friend. You embarrassed yourself last night. I set my phone down and met her gaze, my voice steady. I'll decide who embarrassed whom. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but I stood up, cutting her off. I have work to do, I said, grabbing my keys. Don't wait up. As I drove through the winding streets of Brentwood, my resolve hardened. Lydia had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. That afternoon, I made a call to a private investigator, a man named Carlos whom a colleague had recommended during his own messy divorce. Carlos, I need proof, I said, My voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Follow her. Her calls, her texts, everything. Carlos's voice was calm, professional. Consider it done. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Lydia's betrayal felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But for the first time, I felt something else, determination. She thought she had outsmarted me, that her lies and manipulations would go unchallenged. She was wrong. This concludes the second part of the story. Let me know when you'd like me to continue. The days that followed were a blur of routine and restraint. I played my part, smiling at Lydia when necessary, answering her casual questions about work, and keeping the atmosphere at home as neutral as possible. But underneath the surface, I was boiling. Every glance she threw my way felt like a reminder of the deception I was determined to unravel. Carlos, the private investigator, worked quickly. 3 days after I'd hired him, he sent me a text. Got something. Let's meet. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Santa Monica, a place far enough from Brentwood that Lydia wouldn't stumble upon us by accident. I arrived early, the sound of waves crashing against the shore just audible over the hum of conversation. My coffee sat untouched as I waited, the tension gnawing at me. Carlos arrived exactly on time, carrying a slim manila envelope. He was a sharp-looking man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer and jeans, blending in perfectly with the laid-back LA crowd. Without wasting time, he slid the envelope across the table. I've got pictures, text logs, and call records, he said, his voice low. You were right. Your wife's been seeing someone. A lot. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The first photo hit me like a sledgehammer. It was Lydia and James at Nobu Malibu, a high-end restaurant with a view of the Pacific that we'd once called our spot. In the picture, James had his hand on her lower back as they waited for their table, her smile one I hadn't seen in years. There were more. Lydia entering the Fairmont Miramar Hotel, James close behind. Another showed them leaving together hours later, her hair slightly disheveled. The timestamps on the photos matched the nights she'd claimed to be working late. Carlos leaned forward, his voice cutting through my fog of anger. There's more. I accessed her call logs and texts. She's been messaging him daily. Take a look. I flipped through the papers. The messages were damning. James, last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. Lydia, me too. Can't wait to see you again. Maybe your place next time? James, absolutely. Anything for you, gorgeous. My stomach turned. Carlos's voice pulled me back. This isn't just an affair. She's been spending your money on him. Gifts, hotel stays, even dinners. Some charges are on shared credit cards. I clenched my jaw. How much are we talking? Carlos hesitated. A few thousand so far, but it adds up quickly. The betrayal hit me harder than I expected. Not only was she sneaking around, but she was using the life we built together to fund her affair. It wasn't just infidelity, it was theft. That evening, I returned home, my face carefully blank. Lydia greeted me in the kitchen, dressed in yoga pants and a tank top, sipping wine as if she didn't have a care in the world. Hey, she said, her tone breezy. Dinner's almost ready. How was your day? I forced a smile. Busy, but productive. You? Oh, the usual, she replied, flipping the salmon she was pan-searing. Meetings, deadlines, the usual chaos. She wasn't even trying to hide it. It was almost insulting. As we ate, I studied her closely. Every laugh, every casual comment felt rehearsed, as if she were performing the role of the devoted wife. But now, I knew better. My stomach churned at the sight of her, but I stayed composed. I needed more time to prepare. The next day, I met with my lawyer, Samantha Pierce, in her office in Century City. She was sharp, confident, and didn't mince words. You've got a strong case, Samantha said after I showed her the evidence. California is a no-fault divorce state, so infidelity won't necessarily give you a financial advantage. But the misuse of marital funds? That's leverage. We'll push for a settlement that protects your assets. I nodded, my mind racing. What about the house? If you can prove she used joint assets to fund her affair, we might be able to argue that she forfeited her claim to it. Custody of any shared accounts or significant assets could lean in your favor, but we'll need to tread carefully. Do it, I said firmly. I want her out of my life, and I want to keep what's mine. Samantha gave a small nod. We'll also need to monitor her activity over the next few weeks. The more we can document, the stronger our position. That evening, I continued my charade at home. Lydia chatted about her day while scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Inside, I felt like a volcano ready to erupt. But outwardly, I was calm, patient. Patience, I reminded myself, was the key. She thought she'd won, that I was none the wiser. But every lie she told, every message she sent to James, was another nail in her coffin. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, a plan forming in my mind. Lydia had made a fool of me, but she underestimated the lengths I would go to for justice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This concludes the third part. Let me know when you're ready for the next one. 2 weeks passed like a quiet storm. On the surface, everything in our Brentwood home seemed normal. Dinners together, polite conversations, even the occasional laugh. But beneath the facade, my plan was in motion. Carlos kept feeding me evidence, and Samantha was building a watertight case. I thought I had all the pieces, but then came the twist that changed everything. It was mid-March when Carlos called me. His voice had an edge of urgency I hadn't heard before. Alex, we need to meet. Now. We agreed on a discreet diner in Westwood. I arrived first, sitting in a corner booth where I could see everyone who came and went. Carlos arrived minutes later, sliding into the seat across from me. He placed a flash drive and another envelope on the table, his expression unusually serious. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding. You were right about the affair, he began, lowering his voice. But it's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. I frowned. What do you mean? Carlos pulled out a few photos from the envelope. At first, I thought they were more of Lydia and James. Hotel lobbies, restaurants, parking lots. But then I noticed something different. In these photos, James wasn't the only man. Lydia was with someone else, a man older than James, well-dressed in an unmistakable Hermes suit. Who's this? I asked, flipping through the photos. That's Charles Donovan, Carlos said, his voice grim. CEO of Lydia's company. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd heard Lydia mention Charles before, usually in glowing terms about his leadership and charisma. But seeing them together, his hand on her arm, her leaning into him, painted a very different picture. Carlos continued. They've been meeting for weeks, usually during the day. The timing overlaps with some of the charges you flagged. She's not just seeing James, Alex. She's involved with her boss, too. The betrayal deepened in my chest, a heavy weight pressing against my ribs. I thought I had uncovered the worst of it, but this new revelation was like finding a fresh wound when the old one hadn't even begun to heal. It gets worse, Carlos said, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen was a transcript of a recorded conversation between Lydia and James. Lydia, Charles found out about us. He's furious. If he tells HR, I'm screwed. James, I told you this would happen. You're playing a dangerous game. Lydia, I didn't have a choice. Charles knows things. About the money, about everything. I looked up at Carlos, my hands shaking. What does she mean? About the money? Carlos leaned forward, his voice low. We think she's been embezzling funds from the company. Charles knows about it and has been using it to keep her under his thumb. The room seemed to spin as I processed his words. Lydia wasn't just cheating. She was entangled in something far more sinister. The woman I'd shared my life with, trusted implicitly, was caught in a web of deceit that threatened to destroy everything. That evening, I returned home with a new sense of resolve. Lydia greeted me in the kitchen, as always, her smile as fake as ever. How was your day? She asked, pouring herself a glass of wine. Productive, I said, forcing a smile. How about you? Oh, same old, she replied breezily. Meetings, deadlines. You know how it is. I nodded, watching her closely. She was an actress in her own play, unaware that the audience had seen behind the curtain. The betrayal burned hotter now, but I held it in check. I needed to play the long game. The next day, I met with Samantha to share Carlos's findings. She reviewed the new evidence, her sharp eyes scanning the transcripts and photos. "This changes things," she said finally. "If we can prove she's been embezzling, it strengthens your position significantly. But we need to be careful. This isn't just about your divorce anymore. It's a criminal matter." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "What do we do?" "We keep gathering evidence," Samantha said firmly. "And when the time is right, we hit her with everything. But for now, act normal. Don't give her any reason to suspect you know." The following week, Carlos sent me one final bombshell, a video. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Lydia and Charles, on the balcony of a luxury suite at the Ritz-Carlton, Los Angeles. They were locked in an embrace that left no room for doubt, their voices carrying faintly over the sound of the city below. "You're amazing, Lydia," Charles said, his hand tracing a path down her back. "But you know the deal. If James talks, it's over for both of us." Lydia laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "He won't talk. He's too scared. Besides, I know how to handle him." I watched the video alone in my car, the city lights blurring through the windshield as my world shattered once again. Lydia wasn't just cheating. She was manipulating, scheming, and lying on a scale I hadn't imagined. But now, I had everything I needed to destroy her house of cards. The stage was set. It was time to end this. The weight of the revelations pressed heavily on me as I sat in my car outside the house that Lydia and I had once called a sanctuary. It was now just a facade, a hollow shell of the life we'd built together. But that hollow shell was about to come crashing down. By now, the pieces of her deceit were all laid out before me. Her affair with James, her manipulation by Charles, and the tangled mess of embezzlement that threatened to consume her career. I had the evidence, the strategy, and the resolve. All I needed was timing. That night, I returned home with a sense of purpose. Lydia was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine on the coffee table. She barely looked up when I entered. "You're home late," she said, her tone casual, as if everything was normal. "Busy day," I replied, loosening my tie. "Just had to tie up some loose ends." She nodded absently, her attention still on her screen. I knew what she was doing, texting James, or maybe even Charles. It didn't matter anymore. Soon, they'd all be exposed. The next morning, I met Samantha at her office in Century City. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows did little to lighten the mood as we finalized the plan. "We have enough to file for divorce and secure your assets," Samantha said, her tone professional but firm. "The embezzlement complicates things, though. If we involve the authorities, it could blow everything wide open." "Good," I said, my voice cold. "She deserves it." Samantha leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Just remember, Alex, this will get messy. Be prepared for the fallout." I nodded. "I've been preparing since the night I saw James's hand on her waist." She slid a stack of documents across the desk. "Sign these. They'll officially initiate the divorce proceedings. I'll handle the rest." I picked up the pen and signed my name with a steadiness that surprised even me. It was the beginning of the end for Lydia. The following weekend, Lydia announced she had another work trip to San Francisco. I played along, even offering to drive her to the airport. As she kissed me goodbye, her lips as cold as her lies, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. This time, I wasn't just a passive observer. Carlos was waiting at the airport, ready to follow her every move. By the time I got back to Brentwood, his updates were already coming in. Lydia wasn't heading to San Francisco at all. Instead, she met James at a boutique hotel in Hollywood. From there, they drove together to a private villa in Malibu, where Charles was waiting. It was a meeting of conspirators, and I had front row seats. Carlos sent photos and audio recordings over the next 2 days. Lydia, James, and Charles had spent hours together, discussing how to manage the growing risks. James was growing nervous, worried about the evidence against them. Charles, ever the manipulator, assured them both that everything was under control. "She'll take care of it," Charles said in one recording. "She always does." She was Lydia, of course. The fixer, the schemer, the woman who had turned lying into an art form. But this time, there was no escape. Every word, every move was documented. When Lydia returned home that Sunday night, she was her usual cheerful self, recounting fake stories about her conference. I smiled, nodded, and played the part of the supportive husband, all the while knowing the storm I was about to unleash. The next morning, Samantha filed the divorce papers. They were served to Lydia that afternoon at her office. I received a frantic call from her moments later. "Alex," she cried. "What the hell is this? Divorce? What are you talking about?" "Check your email," I said, my tone flat, before hanging up. I had sent her a neatly compiled dossier of the evidence, photos, texts, recordings. Everything was there, a meticulously crafted chronicle of her lies. Minutes later, she burst through the front door, her face pale and panicked. "Alex, please," she began, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like." I stood my ground, arms crossed. "It's exactly what it looks like, Lydia. You lied. You cheated. And you stole." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to spin excuses, but her words were meaningless. The Lydia I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who had destroyed everything we'd built. That evening, I met Carlos at a bar in West Hollywood. He handed me one last envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "A little bonus," he said with a smirk. Inside were additional photos and transcripts, evidence of Charles's involvement in corporate fraud. Carlos had uncovered more than I'd asked for, and now I had the means to take Charles down too. The stage was set. Lydia had ruined our marriage, but I would ruin her carefully constructed world. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Lydia's world was unraveling, but it was only the beginning. After serving her the divorce papers and revealing the mountain of evidence against her, I thought I had the upper hand. Little did I know, another layer of betrayal was waiting to surface. The morning after I served Lydia, I received a call from Carlos. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his tone serious. "I found something unexpected." "What now?" I asked, irritation creeping into my voice. I thought I had uncovered everything there was to know. "Meet me at the office," Carlos said. "You'll want to see this in person." An hour later, I sat in Carlos's modest office in Santa Monica, the blinds drawn and a cup of untouched coffee on the desk before me. Carlos slid a folder across the table, his expression unusually grim. "This just came in from a source at Lydia's company," he said. "It's not just Charles and James. There's a third player." I frowned, flipping open the folder. Inside were photos of Lydia with another man, a tall, silver-haired executive I didn't recognize. He was impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of power that made others fall in line. The photos showed them at a private dining room in the Peninsula Beverly Hills, their heads close together in hushed conversation. "Who is this?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Martin Shaw," Carlos replied, "Senior Vice President of Finance at Lydia's company. He's been covering for her embezzlement." I stared at the photos, disbelief washing over me. "So, she's not just having an affair. She's running some kind of scam?" Carlos nodded. "It's bigger than we thought. Shaw's been funneling money through fake accounts, likely to cover Lydia's tracks. She's not just involved. She's central to the whole operation." I leaned back in my chair, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Lydia wasn't just a cheater. She was a criminal. And now, I had evidence that could not only ruin her marriage but also her career and reputation. That night, I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. Lydia was in the living room, staring blankly at the television. She looked exhausted, her usual polish dulled by the stress of the past few days. "Alex," she began, her voice pleading. "Can we talk?" "Sure," I said, sitting across from her. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I know I made mistakes, big ones, but we've been together for so long. Isn't there a way we can fix this? I love you." I almost laughed at the audacity. "Love? Don't insult me, Lydia. You don't love me. You love what I've provided for you. And now, you're trying to salvage what's left of your carefully crafted lies." Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing. "Alex, please. I'll do anything to make it right." I leaned forward, my voice cold. Then tell me about Martin Shaw. Her face went pale, the color draining as if I'd struck her. What are you talking about? I pulled out one of the photos Carlos had given me and placed it on the coffee table. This. Explain it. Her hands trembled as she picked up the photo, her lips parting in a futile attempt to form an excuse. It's not what it looks like, she whispered. It never is, I shot back. But I have more. Photos, texts, financial records. You're finished, Lydia. She stared at me, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. You don't understand, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice, I said. You chose this. You chose to cheat, to lie, to steal. And now, you're going to face the consequences. The next day, I met with Samantha and Carlos to finalize the next phase of our plan. With the new evidence, we had a solid case not just for the divorce, but also for exposing Lydia's criminal activities. This could get ugly, Samantha warned. If we bring this to light, it won't just hurt Lydia. It'll involve her company, Charles, James, and now Martin Shaw. Are you ready for that kind of fallout? I don't care, I said. They're all complicit, and they deserve whatever's coming. 2 days later, Samantha filed a motion to subpoena Lydia's financial records, including her communications with Martin Shaw. It was a bold move, one that would force everything into the open. As expected, Lydia's lawyers pushed back, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, Carlos continued digging. What he uncovered next was the final nail in the coffin, a series of offshore accounts tied to both Lydia and Martin Shaw. The accounts contained hundreds of thousands of dollars, siphoned from company funds. With this discovery, Samantha contacted federal authorities. It was no longer just a divorce case, it was a criminal investigation. The second twist came when Lydia's company, desperate to save face, offered a deal. If I refrained from pressing charges, they would cooperate fully with the divorce and ensure that Lydia received nothing. No alimony, no assets, just a clean break. I accepted. Justice would be served in other ways. By the end of March, Lydia had moved out, her once pristine image shattered. She was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own decisions. Charles resigned under the weight of the investigation, and James vanished from the company altogether. As for Martin Shaw, he faced charges that would likely land him in prison. Lydia tried reaching out one last time, leaving a voicemail filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I deleted it without listening. By early April, the fallout was in full swing. Lydia's carefully constructed life, with its lies, manipulations, and deceit, was crumbling faster than anyone could have predicted. But for me, this wasn't just about bringing her down. It was about reclaiming my life. The federal investigation into Lydia, Charles, and Martin Shaw gained traction quickly. The offshore accounts Carlos uncovered had opened a Pandora's box of fraud and embezzlement within the company. Lydia's name was at the center of it all, alongside her two accomplices. Headlines across Los Angeles business circles buzzed with the scandal. Top tech executives under investigation for fraud and corporate conspiracy exposed. Embezzlement in Santa Monica startup. For Lydia, the legal consequences were only beginning. Charles, ever the self-preservationist, turned on her almost immediately, providing authorities with emails and text messages that implicated her deeper than anyone else. Martin Shaw, cornered by his own greed, followed suit. The two men painted Lydia as the mastermind behind the scheme, a narrative that stuck thanks to the evidence Samantha and Carlos had compiled. On the divorce front, things went exactly as planned. Samantha ensured that Lydia received no alimony, no claim to the house, and no access to any joint assets. The court awarded me sole ownership of our Brentwood home and a significant majority of our savings. Lydia had no legal ground to stand on. The final court hearing was anticlimactic. Lydia sat across from me, a shadow of the woman she once was. Her designer clothes and polished demeanor were gone, replaced with a hollow expression and plain attire. When the judge signed the divorce decree, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. It was done. The evening after the divorce was finalized, I sat alone in the living room of my now quiet home. The absence of Lydia's presence was palpable, but it was also freeing. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, my last from the bottle that had seen me through countless sleepless nights, and raised it in a silent toast to my newfound freedom. The unexpected twist came a week later. Carlos called me with an update I wasn't prepared for. "Alex, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Remember James?" "How could I forget?" I replied bitterly. "Well, it turns out he wasn't just a pawn. He's been secretly working with the authorities for weeks. He provided them with key evidence about Lydia and Charles. Without him, the case might not have moved forward so quickly." I sat back, stunned. The man I had written off as nothing more than Lydia's plaything had turned the tables. While it didn't absolve him in my eyes, I couldn't deny that his actions had helped accelerate Lydia's downfall. "That's ironic," I muttered. "He helped take her down while I was busy doing the same." The day Lydia was arrested was one I'll never forget. I wasn't there to witness it, but Carlos sent me a photo of her being escorted out of her office in handcuffs. Her head was bowed, her once impeccable hair disheveled, as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. It was the ultimate public humiliation. For me, it wasn't about schadenfreude. It was about closure. Lydia had destroyed our marriage and betrayed everything we stood for. But now, she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. By the end of May, my life had begun to rebuild itself. I left my job at the engineering firm and accepted a new position with a company based in Manhattan Beach. The fresh start felt right, like a clean slate after months of chaos. I also started seeing someone, a woman named Rachel I'd met through mutual friends. She was kind, grounded, and unafraid to call me out when I got lost in my own thoughts. It was early days, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hope for the future. Lydia's trial began in late summer, and I chose not to attend. Samantha kept me updated, and I was satisfied to hear that both Charles and Martin Shaw were handed lengthy prison sentences. Lydia, thanks to her plea deal, avoided significant jail time but was left financially ruined and blacklisted from the industry. She would spend the next decade paying restitution to the company and rebuilding a life she had torn apart. One night, as I stood on the balcony of my Brentwood home, looking out over the city lights, I reflected on the whirlwind that had been the past few months. The man I was before Lydia's betrayal felt like a stranger, naive, trusting, and oblivious to the cracks forming in his world. But the man I had become was stronger, wiser, and more resolute. Lydia's lies had nearly destroyed me, but in the end, they gave me something I hadn't expected: freedom. Freedom to start over. Freedom to build a life rooted in honesty and trust. And for that, I was strangely grateful.